up?
Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. That's an original composition I wrote 10 minutes before this.
Oh, wow.
Okay, guys, welcome to the show. This is a special episode of That's All Folks, Feat. Wynton Wong. I wish I had. I was going to get an applause sound effect. So, this is a special episode. I mean, in general, longtime listeners of this podcast know I pretty much just, this is just sort of like my digital living room. This podcast, it's just kind of like, sometimes I do shows that repeat. Like I have SEO show, and I had a Science Thursday, and I have things that are like repeated episodes, but then also I just kind of have like whatever, just things, just conversations. Longtime listeners will know about 7 months ago or 8 months ago, I talked to my friend Paul Miller, who's famous for leaving the internet for a year and famous for being like a libertarian Christian sort of like capitalist, anarcho-capitalist person from The Verge. And we talked about basically what it means to be a man going forward in the world and stuff. And, just this current era. And I feel like this is maybe another chapter in that thing. That episode was called Ryan and Paul Destroy All Men or Exterminate All Men. So this is maybe like chapter 2 or 3, but
the continued extermination of humans.
So here's why I asked Wynton Wong, and maybe I don't know if anybody listening knows you, but I don't know, the way I know you is because like you worked at the Outline with a lot of my friends who do video stuff. Billy, Sam, Adrian, Jordan, various friends all worked with you at the Outline. And I actually I met you once IRL when we were going to do a 24-hour podcast festival. Yeah. That's the one time I met you IRL.
No, we failed pretty spectacularly.
Kind of failed.
It was fun.
Mm-hmm. We had fun. We hung out. We didn't really do much else. It was kind of a fun night. But so, yeah. And I've heard you like speak on the Tomorrow podcast before too.
Yeah.
But okay, so here's how this all started. We're in a group Slack channel with a lot of video people, a lot of those people who worked at the Outline. We have a Slack channel we have many Slack channels in our group.
Too many, really poorly defined.
Too many, but I feel like, we could talk about this more, but I feel like it's good that all of the conversations are all like spread out. What do you think?
Yeah, I think with like the number of people in the Slack, I think it's really helpful, and it's easy enough to like group people or like to collate some of the conversations when they do start overlapping.
So we have a bunch of channels. I'll just name a few: Deals, Gaming, Glimmers, Goofs, Grievances, Inspirations, Kind of Neat, Post Your Work, Personal Projects, Politics. And so basically, if you whatever you want to talk about, you go into the room. And we have a general too, which is just for everything. But whatever you want to talk about, you put it in that room. And so we have this room called Grievances, where it's pretty active, I would say.
There's a lot of grief in the world.
And so you go in there. The reason for separating out the grievances what we were kind of going for was like people would go into the general chat room and they would post some bad news and it would kind of bum people out. And so it was sort of our way of like separating the bad news from just like general. So grievances is pretty active. And a week or 2 weeks ago, I was feeling really bad. I don't know. I was just like having like high stress. I was looking at the news and seeing like how like everybody was trashing the national parks during the government shutdown.
Yeah.
And just like general bad stuff was happening and I was feeling bad. And I typed into our agreement. Can I read our chat? Okay.
Read the blog.
I said, I feel irresponsible for not sparking a revolution. Everything sucks, and I'm the most privileged person on earth, and I'm just letting it all continue to suck. You came in a few minutes later and said, same, but with a feeling of futility due to my race and gender. And then I was like, fuck. I feel like, I didn't say fuck, but that's what I thought. I said, I feel like I've been so blinded by my race/gender, etc., that I can't trust my instincts on pretty much anything, you know? Like, I read the think pieces, I watch the shows, I watch the movies, I read the academics, I try to download as much perspective as I can. I just feel like I do feel fundamentally flawed, or at least generally unworthy of attention, power, or say. Sounds pretty emo, but this is how I feel, I guess, right now. So that's where I was like, you know, we both feel futile in this moment. And we feel futile because of who we are and where we are. I don't know. I just feel like it's like if both of us feel stuck, then nothing's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I was having a conversation with another friend last night, where like there was this attempt to try to define this feeling, and why we feel this way about ourselves or like each other.
Mm-hmm.
And we failed. We definitely failed doing that. But there was this thing where like he said, you know, the phrase like we contain multitudes. Like if people genuinely believed it, we probably wouldn't have the sheer amount of anxiety that we do, because there would be an implicit understanding that like there's our context of our race, our gender, our socioeconomic class, all of that, but we would understand that that's just like a part of things, and it wouldn't motivate us, nor would it be an obstacle for like the actions that we take place or that we choose to take. And yeah, like I always admire, I don't know if admire is the right word, but I always find it really interesting, like the people who can be quote unquote shameless and like do the actions that can be so difficult for like us. But I also don't want to be like a shameless person, because that seems like a terrible way to live.
So one technical note: how close are you from the microphone?
I'm pretty close, but I can get closer.
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay, so when you say shameless, what do you mean by that?
I think I mean the people that do the work that some of us do. Like the extent is kind of up to every person, and then they act like regardless of like the potential negative consequences that they perceive. So like, for example, they wouldn't, you know, they may have done the things that you did, like read the think pieces and watch the shows and all that stuff, and realize that like, oh, there's like a lot of perspectives that I don't really understand, and be like, fuck it, still gonna do it.
Yeah. And so you say you're envious of that?
I think there's a certain contentness that I perceive from those people, because like they don't wake up in the middle of the night with like deep dread, and that seems like a really nice way to live.
Yeah. Do you feel like the people that you're talking about who are shameless are mostly white dudes though, or are you talking about literally everyone?
I think it applies to everybody. So I don't know if you ever heard, there used to be, I mean there still is, and I haven't like watched her stuff in a really long time. But there's like this YouTube channel called Shameless Maya, and it was about this woman like choosing to, you know, like self-publicize and like to be like more shameless, right, about like her wants and needs and desires, and like that was like the whole point of her channel, and I think like she does pretty well. But it's the same thing where like I feel like, oh, like that was great, like you've clearly achieved some of the tasks or the goals that you had like labeling yourself as shameless, but it also seems like a really exhausting way to live.
Yeah. I know what you mean. You know who I think of when you say that is like, do you know Trisha Paytas on YouTube? So she's like, I think she defines herself that way too, which is like there's no filter. Like every like drama in her life, she turns on the camera and starts just like bawling and then posts like a 25-minute video that everyone eats up because they feel like there is no filter at all. She's literally letting you just like see the inside of her brain. Is that the kind of shameless that you're a little bit envious of?
Yeah. And I think like there's like this clarity in like their, like they know who they are. You know, they know who they are to the extent that like they're willing to just like let any and all people, you know, like view it and experience it, and it's like that's not like reflective of, I think, like that most people, and then especially like me.
Mm-hmm. But I would say I have like, so it's I've been thinking about this a lot about how I would define or how the word authenticity is like thrown around a lot. Like I think one of the reasons why we voted for Trump is that he seemed authentic and he seemed to be shameless. He seemed to have no, like, she seems to be like the sort of like Trisha Paytas, like what you see is what you get. And I guess what I'm saying is, or what I've been thinking is like, sure, there's like good things about having no filter, but I feel like we're also seeing the bad things about having no filter.
Totally. I mean, yeah, I think like Billy had a pretty long, very thoughtful, nice, heartwarming response to our like dread dump. But like he kind of like very correctly pointed out like how important like the self-awareness and the filtering is. I think like there's just like another layer that like I can intellectually understand where Billy's coming from, but like that's not how I feel, and that's not how I like respond with action.
Yeah. I knew he is always responding with very thoughtful things like that, but it's like, yeah, that's not what I wanted to hear. I knew that. I know the responsible way to respond to my like emo-ness is like, well, every day is different and you learn a little bit every day and you learn from your mistakes and we're getting better and better every day, etc. And it's like, yeah, that's probably the healthy way to think of everything. But there's this feeling of urgency right now because everything sucks so hard that I can't accept the speed of change. Or I can't accept like, you know, every like incremental change every day somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I think this is something that's like pretty unique to, or not unique, but like my personal perspective on this from like kind of like a Chinese American perspective was that like it was my family's way of coping with the fact that like we had very little control over, how people act against us or how, what exactly we could do for ourselves. And that meant like we could only work on our family and we could only work on the things that we could like reasonably do. And I got really, really frustrated with that. And like I think like one day like my mom like pulled me aside and was like, I see you working really hard trying to like force people to like you and like force people to like admire you or to like create this like rags to riches story because you think that it like will ultimately benefit all of us. But she's like, that's not how like life works. Life is like way more intimate and like way more nothingness than you as like this young feisty like teenager desperately wanting to like change the world can like really do. And that's like the thing that I think I rail against is that like yes there's like this extreme urgency but like there's also like none at the same time, right? Like living a shitty life sucks and like everybody should have not a shitty life, but also like we only have what we have, which is like not helpful and is not a good way to like live your life, but is also the only way that like I don't implode within myself.
Mm-hmm. Right now, I googled you a bit just to like be like, what if there's something I don't know? But I found your Tumblr.
Oh god, it's so old. I haven't been on that in so long.
Yeah, it gave me definitely a taste of your angst a bit.
Oh, my deep teenage angst.
That was a teenage Tumblr?
Yeah. That was like probably like middle school.
Wow.
That was like when I was like catfishing people because I like desperately wanted to figure out if I could like be these different types of people.
What do you mean by that?
It's just like when you're trying on different identities, right? You're like trying to figure out like, oh, well, if I'm not comfortable with this like current version of myself, I'm gonna like see like if I could be like the cool goth kid or if I can be like the weird angsty poet or like whatever it is. And then I, like the only way to like test if people believe you is to like bring in strangers, which is like not healthy, really.
So it was like using the internet as like because you can't see who you are or anything. It was. I don't know. Did it work? Did it feel different? Did you feel like you're somebody else sometimes? Wynton, hello. Oh no. If you're making sound right now, I can't hear you.
Oh no, can you hear me now?
Oh wait. Okay, you're back. One good news though is that at the beginning of this convo, you were really distorted sounding, but now you're clear as heck.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Yeah, I think it worked to an extent, especially because like back then on the internet, people like really believed like how you presented yourself was like who you were, right? Like this was the true authentic me that like the real world could never see, even though that's like not true, but like that's how it felt. And so yeah, like I could like try to be those types of people. And I think like there were certain aspects of those like other versions of myself that I like brought into like my real life personality and like who I eventually or who I currently am. And there's some stuff that like just didn't work out and it just like felt too uncomfortable or it felt like too far off from like whatever the target was.
So one of the things that you're doing now, you're doing something for is it Asian American Film Festival? Is that what it was? Yeah. I don't know what your exact title is, but one of the things I always thought, because we both went to film school, right?
I didn't go to a film school. I just went to like a public university that had a communications department.
Okay. I don't really know if I did either, but I did study film. But I always thought like, why are people why are people so trying to get into festivals and stuff? Like, why don't you just post it to YouTube? Why don't you, like, if you really want people to see your thing, why don't you just like put it online for free? Do you feel like, I don't know, I feel like I know the answer, but like, do you feel like, what's the function of a film festival now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the core functions of a film festival hasn't changed. And I think the best teams that like take advantage of film festivals are also taking advantage of like digital distribution in a really smart way. But like we both know that like just because you put something on YouTube doesn't mean that a shit ton of people are going to see it. Like you have to do a lot of work to actually get people to be able to like find it. And film festivals are about not only like there's a curatorial element where that says like these programmers are going through these pieces and they're building like a full narrative or a full program that will hopefully reveal more about whatever the theme of your festival is for an audience. And then the other, I think the more important part about a film festival is that you're bringing together a bunch of storytellers and people who love storytelling to have like conversations, right? Like something like, for example, for this year's festival that I really want to make sure that we focus on in terms of the discourse is like, I want to talk about like the rampant colorism that happens in Asian diasporic films, right? The colorism that is like so inherently part of how a lot of people who have immigrated to Western countries deal with and that we hold implicitly. So we know, like we intellectually know that like if you were to take Chinese people, for example, that we all don't have pure white skin. You know, like there's a large population of people who are like much tanner and much browner. But when you watch Chinese film or even by films by Chinese Americans or British Chinese people, everybody has like the same skin color, right? Even though they may all be Chinese. And that's just not representative. It also like perpetuates colorism. And it also, I think, blends into why there is tensions between like certain populations of like African American and Asian populations, right? Because we keep buying into colorism. So like that's the type of discourse that I want to like, and I think that's what the type of discourse that film festivals allow like a safe stage to, where like we really want to be critical about the stories that we tell and how we tell them.
I never heard of the word colorism until you just said it. Is it different from racism? Like, what's the difference?
Yeah, so colorism is like really specifically about like the tone, the skin tone, right? Like, so even within Afro communities, there is definitely conversations within there where they talk about the fact that there are kind of more light-skinned African American celebrities, and that when it comes to actual truly like really dark-skinned artists, we don't see them very often. So like, for example, when Jordan Peele's like Us trailer came out, there was like a good amount of like obviously celebration that he's doing another movie, but also the fact that the family within this film, like pretty much every single member of this family are like truly dark-skinned like African heritage people, right? They're not your kind of, I don't know, people. It's not even just about passing white, but like that people were lighter skinned and people that it made it feel like it's easier to accept African American people, but only if they're like closer to our skin tone.
Yeah,
like,
that makes sense. Okay, that's actually, I've never heard that, and that's interesting. It's like, yeah, it's like putting sugar and milk in your coffee.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's like interesting when you put it in context of like, for a lot of white communities, being tan is something that is often viewed as like a luxury, right? Or something that makes you like of a higher socioeconomic class because like you can take the time to go to a holiday or on vacation or to get your spray tan. But it's the opposite for a lot of other cultures, where if you're darker, if you're a tanner, there's an implication that you are a like a worker. So, right, you're working construction and that's why you're dark, or you're a farmer and that's why you're dark, and therefore you must be of like a lower socioeconomic class.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think like in the context of America, that message gets really jumbled. And so, like, if you come from an immigrant family, you may not have like fully thought through, all of those things. But, as an artist or as a director or producer, when you're casting, there may be an implicit bias that you're not confronting. And so, like, that's a conversation that is really interesting to have, and is like one of the reasons why like a festival environment where like we all, there's a certain like reward to being selected in a festival, and that like we're not here to attack people, but we're here to have what can be difficult conversations.
So maybe I should just the problem with this like conversation is like I've been talking to you in my mind for like 2 weeks, and so like I've had about like 3 or 4 hours of conversation with you that I'm now like trying to recreate in this moment, and so I'm like, so okay, so representation, I would love to have a world, I guess. Okay, yeah, here's the thing. Here's where I always come back to whenever I think about representation. I feel like there's like a real chicken and egg problem. Like, the world's racist. Well, why? Because we have like this media and this culture and stuff that is racist and shows us a world, shows us like a sort of a script that we all obey. So how do you change a racist world? Well, you got to make like the entertainment, media and stuff less racist to teach people to be less racist. Well, how do you do that? Well, you got to get those people working into the film industry. You got to get those people telling the stories. The problem is that whole industry is racist, and so those people don't get to tell those stories. And so you have this problem where like do you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
yeah, no, I know. Yeah, I know what, and I think like the capitalism aspect of it also like adds even more like confusion, because this is the argument of like this past summer, right, with like Crazy Rich Asians, was that like it's not just like an artistic or an ethical decision of like increasing representation. It's like a business decision. Like, you haven't been, hey, business people of Hollywood or decision makers in Hollywood, like there are all these people with like XYZ amount of money, and they're gonna give you the money that you've been missing all your life because you're too racist. Which is like not untrue, but also seems like not the point. But I think it goes back to, and I had this conversation with another friend, was, is it okay for non-Black or Asian or Hispanic or whatever people to make stories about those like marginalized communities? And I go on like both sides, is that there are some stories that you should let those people tell them themselves. But also, like, if we're gonna be in a world where we can say anybody can tell any story, then you're gonna have to like let these white people do it. And like whether or not they like crash and fail or are like extremely racist, like that's just the consequence.
Yeah.
But like that sucks. And I think for a while, and this is something that I really wanted to get into, like in terms of like larger culture, was like 8-10 years ago, right? Or maybe even less, like YouTube was like ruled by a bunch of like Asian American creators. And everybody kept like freaking out because it's like, oh my gosh, like this is the future of entertainment. Like this is like finally YouTube has like properly democratized how things are made, and all these people are going to transition into traditional, and they're going to like revolutionize what the entertainment industry looks like. And that like clearly really hasn't happened. And then arguably like internet culture stopped really caring about those Asian creators, right? Like who's left? Like Wong Fu Productions, their like numbers are fine and they still have like cultural significance. and especially on the West Coast, like people really, really respect them. But like nobody's like giving that company a development deal at a network or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Or like even the like community channels of the world, like they just stopped making stuff.
I didn't
like,
know. Can you like what like YouTubers are you talking about? Because like I don't have that. That's not how I think of it.
Right. So like so like Wong Fu Productions, which is still around. They were the quote unquote like first real people that were doing like scripted stuff of like a certain quality. Like the Kev Jumbas of the world, the Niga Higa, like obviously Ryan Higa is still around and his videos do like pretty decent numbers. Community channel, what else is there? I can't remember her name. There was a like Filipina YouTuber that was really popular. The Michelle Fons of the world, right? Like they extended into the beauty guru space, and that was huge because in the US, like you never saw Asian faces in regards to like beauty campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, now if you're like if the first thought of like an Asian person on YouTube, I think like people think of Rice Gum, which is like not a great representative of like the community, but at the same time is like, yeah, like Asian people can be assholes too. But yeah, so like there was this like quote unquote revolution. And then like it like kind of petered out, and now, it's just like whatever change that was supposed to happen like never happened. And like that is hard to deal with, but also I think is like representative of like how difficult it is to actually move the needle in regards to representation, right? Even though like YouTube technically isn't as like old or like rigid as the entertainment industry, like they're like the societal stuff that you talked about is like what ultimately held like a lot of these people back.
Yeah. And like going back to the idea of like feeling like we need like some sort of paradigm shifting moment in our culture. Like I feel like everybody like this is a good week. When that Gillette thing happened at the beginning of the week, I was like, score, because this is exactly what we're talking about. Like this is like, I don't know what their intentions were. I don't know if they're just trying to like hop on the bandwagon, whatever. But everyone knows there's that Gillette ad that came out that was like about toxic masculinity, about like guys have been bad for a long, but now we've got to be good. This is the time we need to change. Everybody get in line. And as much as we want to change really, really fast, or a lot of people do want to change really, really fast, I think a lot of dudes perceive it as inauthentic.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, like, what's the authentic way to change fast? Like, what's going to sell it to these guys? Because, like, I watched the commercial and I thought the part with the guys with the infinite grills was pretty funny.
Yeah.
I thought it was pretty, like, I was like, it was a little bit preachy, you know, but like overall, I was like, I agree with these things. I don't necessarily need Gillette to tell me, but who needs to tell us? And like, what does it look like? Like everybody keeps talking about how there's going to be a civil war. I'm like, I don't know, man. But this is maybe like 2 years ago, I was at the DNC in Cleveland. I was living in Cleveland, or the RNC, and I was just taking advantage of the fact that the whole world was watching Cleveland, and I rode my bike there every day, and I was like on Periscope, and I was periscoping interviews with people out there. And I just kept asking everybody the same question about, well, just like what they were doing there, et cetera, et cetera. But then I eventually got to like, what does like a perfect world look like to you? Like, I know utopia is like a really bad thing. Like, of course, there's no utopia, but what does it look like? And how do we get there? And a lot of people's notions of what a utopia looks like was pretty vague. Everybody's happy and they do whatever they want. But almost everybody said that the way we get there is violence. Like some sort of war needs to happen. Something needs to happen first between now and then. And so I feel like the kind of world that we want to see is so different that we've only ever seen great changes like that with great violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I know Gillette's not the person who's going to take us to like this new world, but I also don't want it to be a war.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's why I'm stuck, and I'm like, what if, as a guy, I feel like I do have the power to say something to my fellow boys that will help them get on board, but I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think like going back to that question, that like authenticity question, like how do we do this authentically? Like, you know, if you were to like sit down with your boys and like try the Gillette way of like, here, let me like tell you like all of these things and like the change that you can make. I don't think like not being a man, but I don't think most men would actually like take that to heart, which I, you know, like that's a weird place to be. But I think change rarely happens fast.
Oh no.
I think like I confronted somebody who's like, man,
Wait, can I stop you
yeah.
for a sec? You cut out for a sec. And it was right when you said change rarely happens fast.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry.
No worries. But yeah, so yeah, confrontation is hard. I think men generally don't deal with it well because they view it as an attack on themselves. Right? It's like their certainty is like their identity. And so if you're to add any uncertainty, it gets uncomfortable for them. And so like I think it has to be like internally motivated, and I'm not really sure if there's like one solution to internally motivate people, right? Like one of the ways is like the whole like I have a sister and a mom and a daughter too, and this is why I'm doing it, and that's fine if that's the reason why. Like you're not going to be as shitty of a person, then like great. But there's probably some other way to like internally motivate men to like confront like how shitty they can be.
Yeah. Like I go back to the idea that like the best way to teach people is with stories. Like is if we would have, if like the last 30 years would have been filled with movies that would have like, I don't know, opened people's eyes about these things. But like, yeah, this is the chicken and the egg problem. It didn't happen. Like, do you agree? Like, do you think like that's why you're doing what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Is you feel like movies and TV and media and stories are the deepest way to get into people.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree that I think stories can get violence. I think violence is really visceral, but stories can do it without physically harming people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like, but this is the thing, and this is something that like I recently, like I'm not great with film history, like I'm not that type of like cinephile, but I recently, like our executive director at the festival sent me a book about Asian American independent cinema in the 70s, and like a lot of the stories that I think could work exist. And it's like ultimately, I think, up to like programmers like me or like critics or people or educators to actually like allow people to watch these stories. And then it also like provides context that like we've been trying to tell the right stories for decades. And like whether it be like capitalism related or accessibility related, like those stories didn't get to the right people. But that doesn't mean that like we can't celebrate and showcase those stories and like show that we've been trying for a really, really long time.
I don't know where to go from here. Here's a question that maybe I don't know if you can just rant on. How would you describe this whole moment? Like, if you had to name, like, I don't know what the world's going to be like 20 years from now, but like, what do you think this era is, and why is it?
I think like the first word that comes to my brain is frustration. And I think the reason why it's like all of this stuff has been building up, right? Like it didn't like magically happen overnight. Like this is like every day is like a revelation and a reminder of like how awful people are in their like small day decisions and how like they eventually become these like huge, large decisions. And so it's almost like this like bottleneck effect. And I think now is like when we're realizing just like how much we've like increased the pressure in our like little world without like dealing with it. And now like I think we're at like that crossroads. It's like we either deal with it, and some people are gonna want to pop the balloon and just start over, and then there's gonna be some people that want to like figure out a way to like slowly let out the pressure. And I'm just not sure like where the vast majority of people want to go. I think realistically we should find a way to like slowly let out the pressure, but it seems like people would rather like take a huge pin and like blow shit up.
Yeah. It does feel like I said, like everybody felt like we need a war or something.
Yeah.
It feels like we need like a different, things need to feel different. Things need to like crumble before they can be rebuilt. It almost feels like.
Yeah. And I was talking to somebody, I was talking about it to like a potential client, and they were talking about like, oh, like how do you like to solve problems? And I was like, I think like, you know, like obviously like be methodical and communicate and all that bullshit. But like I also realized like the past couple of years of like working was like sometimes you just have to start over. Like you have to like take your lumps and be like, I really messed up like most of the way through, and I just have to start over. But like I'm not sure if that applies to like society, because like that's just not how humans are.
Yeah. So you're on Twitter a lot.
Yeah, I like.
Do you feel like, in general, most people, we have the opinion, especially in our Slack group, that Twitter is kind of poisonous. But do you feel like, what do you feel like the usefulness of Twitter is anymore?
For me, it's curating perspectives, and just like constantly trying to find ways to challenge how I think by following a bunch of people I either admire for like personal reasons, or at least like respect their willingness to be like a certain type of way or to have a certain type of opinion. I also think that like for marginalized groups, and oftentimes groups that may not be geographically accessible to each other, that Twitter and like Facebook groups and things that like are like, I agree, are inherently bad. Like Facebook is a terrible place, the same way that Twitter is a terrible place, but like is also now the easiest ways for these people to connect, right? Like I wouldn't be able to work with a lot of the community groups that I work with now if we hadn't like found each other or chatted to each other through like Twitter or Facebook. But I think for like an average person, you have to be like so particular. Like it's that like echo chamber thing. and some people just don't know how to be like. Some people aren't just like people aren't media literate enough to know the consequences of like them constantly following Fox News contributors or whatever.
Yeah. Do you think that's their fault?
No, I think it is like the fault of our education system. I think so. When I was growing up was when like, yes, we had the internet, but also when like people were still really afraid of the internet. And so I remember in middle school, our librarian, like one of the classes that we had for like a good couple months was like new media literacy. And she just kind of like really like forced us to look critically at what at some at things that we like that came really easy to us because like we grew up with the internet, but like that was really helpful. And my theory is, at least like within like the American education system, was that like there's a small window of us that got that media literacy like education, and like we try really hard to like continue doing that for ourselves or try to explain that to others. But once the internet became like extremely prevalent, schools like thought that they didn't need to do this anymore and that like they could just skip it. And so like there are young people that like don't have media literacy, even though they're technically using the internet like far, far more than any of us ever did.
What kinds of stuff were you learning?
We were learning about like source checking, like fact checking things, knowing and understanding like what sources are quote unquote credible, or what sources you should like double check and see if those things are correct. We like figured how to like Boolean search, like how do you filter through like the vastness of the internet to find a thing that you actually want, or to go down the avenue where it is like fruitful for you to go down that rabbit hole and not like a terrible, like you're not going into worse and worse stuff. But I think also this was like pre-algorithm hell, right? Like, yes, Google was an algorithm, right? The spiders were technically like ranking searches, but like it wasn't so difficult to like figure out like how it was ranked and to like make sure that it made sense. But yeah, it's the same thing as like we would go home and like we would tell our parents about it and they'd be like, oh yeah, wow, like, that is a better way to do X, Y, and Z thing. But yeah, if I were to like pull a 12-year-old and be like, hey, do you know how to Boolean search in Google? They'll, for the most part, they don't. And so like they'll just, search for a thing and they'll just like go through pages and pages and pages instead of like that time in half and like being efficient about it.
I don't even know what Boolean search is.
It's like when you add like plus, minus, like indicators.
Okay. Yeah.
Right.
I didn't know the word for that, but yeah, I guess I've done that.
Yeah. Like you just like know how to like filter a little bit more.
Yeah. It is useful.
It's super useful.
Yeah. Especially when you like have a word that's close to another thing and you have to like say minus this.
Yeah. Or like if you know that there are like certain sources that keep popping up and you don't want to see it anymore. Like,
yeah.
Super great. Super helpful. But like nobody teaches it to people, I guess, anymore.
That's kind of crazy. Are you sure about that? Are you sure there's no media literacy classes out there?
I'm sure there are, but like I babysat people, like I used to babysit. Oh, this is really bad. I used to babysit this family in Manhattan Beach in California. And it's like a really nice neighborhood. And I used to like drive from the valley all the way over there because they paid really well, which was great. But it was like a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old. And they like just didn't understand how, or the choices that they were making on the internet and how they were affecting them. And I remember it got to the point where the 13-year-old was going through that YouTube like algorithm of like watching weird anti-feminist stuff that was just like full of like lies and bullshit. And it was like affecting how he was like communicating with me and how like I assumed he was communicating with like other girls in his life, right? And I had to like pull him aside and be like, do you understand like what you're watching, right? You're not just like repeating verbatim what they're saying and assuming that is true. And he's like, well, like, of course it is. Like, why would they tell me wrong things? And it's like, because like we can't, like, that's just how it is. Like, people lie. People also have beliefs that like aren't factually true. And so like we had longer conversations about that, and like who knows how he is now. But I also remember like pulling their mom aside and being like, hey, you really need to monitor like what they're watching. You know, like we had strict TV time limits, but you also need to have limits when they're on YouTube and like know what they're watching. And like the mom was like so surprised that like this is the type of stuff they were watching, because like basically it'd be like they started with like a Roblox video, and then because of how like the algorithm worked, they like got to this like ridiculous like men rant. And I was like, yeah, so like you just like you have access to their accounts, just like, you know, every now and then peek through what they're watching. Like it's not that hard, and it's also like not that like out of reach, right? It was the same way when I was younger. Like I would go to the library and like pull books that I thought I was going like of my own free will, but like I know that my parents were like making sure that they knew what I was like reading. And like, you know, if there's anything that was like a little weird, like they'll bring it up and like ask me my rationale for like pulling that type of book out.
Wow. You sounded a lot smarter than me. I don't think I was definitely not going to the library pulling books.
Well, I mean, I grew up in the South. Like there was only like so many things we could do.
So you really think that, I don't know where to go from here.
I mean, it goes back to that thing about like, you know, storytelling may be like the only effective tool to like change people's minds. And I think like it starts for younger people like at the YouTube side, or like now it's like TikTok, but like those are stories. Those are like little tiny stories that like seed themselves in people and like really affect how they communicate and like why they communicate in a certain way. And so like it's dumb. I still think it's so dumb when people like when older people like don't believe the influence that these platforms have. And I'm like, you know, like you grew up on fucking Star Trek and like it influenced like every step of your career. Like why would it be so hard to understand that like these kids watch the same TikTok creators and it influences like the choices that they make?
Yeah. Exactly. I was thinking about today, speaking of film history, like, do you know about the Hays Code?
Mm-hmm.
That was like, for the listeners, it's like the rules of Hollywood. Back in the 1930s and 40s, it was like, if somebody does something bad, they better be punished. You can't show man and woman in bed together. All these rules about basically acknowledging the power of moving pictures and their influence over the society, and then trying to like clamp down on anything that might foster bad behavior, because it really was the acknowledgement of the power of the moving picture. So yeah, you're totally right.
Yeah,
we've always known
and
it.
I think like the Hays Code also created this like counter revolution too of gossip mags and like tabloids, right? Like if the Hays Code didn't exist, we wouldn't have like trashy mags, right? Because people like so desperately wanted to know what was this quote, like what is the real tea behind like these stories and these celebrities and these people that like they really looked up to. And like that made things really, really complicated. And that's why they're like fixers in Hollywood and all that kind of stuff.
I hadn't heard that. So you do know more about film history than me then.
I mean, I'm trying. Like,
but that's
I feel like I need to like relearn stuff. Like I feel dumber all the time. And so like trying to make a concerted effort is it, you know, it like requires time and energy, but like it's nice to like learn things again.
Yeah. Yeah. I do feel dumber every day. The more I read, the more I feel like I don't know anything.
Yeah, it sucks, but it also, I don't know. It's nice to be surprised when you read something. You're like, oh, fuck, like that's crazy. And then, get excited and share it.
So do you think, is there any hope? One of the things I keep coming back to is, do you think there's any hope for old men?
Ooh,
For old white men? Because like I want to believe, I guess my dream is like there could be something that could happen that would like totally change them. But if I'm honest, I'm kind of with the people that are like, you just gotta let some people die and let the new generation of TikTokers take over.
yeah. Yeah, I think there is like some type of like arbitrary deadline where like you're too far gone. But I also think that there's like, if you're like, if you're older but you haven't hit that deadline, like I still believe that you can improve. Whether or not you can be like fully reformed, I'm not really sure, but like you could. So the example is one of my old roommates, we like inevitably talked about like the election or whatever. And I told him, I was like, well, honestly, like my mom has voted for Republican candidates in the past, and like this past presidential election, she left the presidential bit blank. Like she didn't feel comfortable making a decision, even though she did the work, she like tried to inform herself, but she like personally did not feel comfortable like filling a bubble. And my roommate was like kind of mad, which was a little crazy to me. But like he was like, that's like, I mean, that's the type of people that like they helped ruin the country. And I was like, but like I don't think that's the type of people you should be like quote unquote attacking. Right? Like the people that you should like consider are the people that like always straight balloted Republican. Right? But yeah, like I think there's like a line, maybe it's like 65. Like post 65, like sorry. Pre 65, like let's have a conversation.
Yeah. The way I think of it is like, you know how I don't know if you had this, but in language class, like I took Spanish, and my Spanish teacher was always like, you guys got to do this earlier and earlier. Like at a certain point, like when you get into your 20s, language gets harder and harder to learn because your brain is less and less flexible.
Totally.
And I feel like culture is a language. Like it's a program that runs in the background. It's like habits. And at a certain point, your habits become calcified like stone. And like you said, like it might be like 65, you're totally fucking rock. Like there's no flexibility left. This is permanent.
Yeah.
It might be true.
Yeah.
And that's pretty sad. And I do feel like you said, like sympathy for your mom. Like as people, you have to have sympathy for people who I don't know if culture is changing faster than ever. I have to believe that technology is making culture change faster than ever.
Yeah.
And so I look at older people as like, what do we do? How do we, even myself, I like say, what do I do? How do I catch myself up? How do I make sure that I'm never the person who looks at new culture and sees it as like an attack on what I think human beings are?
Yeah.
And I always think of this one tweet it was circulating like around 2016, around the election, specifically like, men, we don't want you to go away. We want you to like go off on a vision quest, take a bunch of psychedelics and come back to the tribe, a changed person.
Right.
And I think about, I did this one documentary about PTSD and MDMA and how people who have gone through traumatic things take psychedelics and they actually cause connections between brain cells and neurogenesis, like the growth of brain cells and things like that. And to me, my only radical solution for old people is to almost literally give them psychedelics and like almost give them brain fertilizer still to allow them to give them their flexibility back almost. And maybe that's, irresponsible.
But I mean, but like, what's the point of like figuring out this stuff and like technology, right? Like there's this, like, it's like fucking Mark Zuckerberg saying, it's like, oh, Facebook is about like connecting people. Like that was the attempt of the technology, but like that's not what it is. But if like drug science means that we can like maintain neuroplasticity for longer, then like let's talk about it. But I also think like with things like MDMA and like psychedelics, the way that I think about it is they tight on them to make a decision.
Wait, can you restart your thing about psychedelics? For some reason, every once in a while you cut out and you're like, the thing about psychedelics, and it's just silent. And I'm like, oh no.
But yeah, so okay. The thing about psychedelics is like they fundamentally mess with how we perceive time and space. And so like I think one of the reasons why people go and think of kind of deeper stuff when they're on psychedelics, like, because like technically we could think about anything, right? Like we could be thinking about like food, but like very rarely do people have trips about food. They have trips about like themselves or like their space or their position in like the society or like their relationships. Because I think it allows people, when there isn't that feeling of like a time constraint or like they're under pressure to make a decision, people can actually like explore some of the thoughts and feelings that like they've always had. And I don't know if there's like a way to replicate that in a non like high state where like you can create a space where there isn't a time pressure and there isn't like a choice, like decision-making pressure for people to like explore some of the thoughts and feelings that they've had, right? I don't know. I guess it's that thing where it's like everybody should go to therapy.
Yeah.
But like that's just not accessible for most people.
Yeah. The way I think of it, and like one thing I've been thinking about doing, and I just keep coming back to it and thinking like, this is very illegal. I can't do that. But I keep thinking about like I need to just get a bunch of ecstasy and go to like different dudes, make them take it. I'll take it with them. And the reason why they say like MDMA is specifically good for treating PTSD is because it like shuts down your fear center. Mm. So a lot of the times they're thinking about how like a grenade went off and they watched their friend die, and that thought is very scary to think about. And that thought is what triggers the PTSD symptoms. But then you take the MDMA, your fear center shut down. You're able to think of that very scary thing, but think about it without the fear and make other mental associations to it that aren't scary. And then that's sort of how you get over it. And so I don't know. I'm not sure what men's I think a lot of men's visceral reaction to a lot of the news is, I don't know if it's fear. I don't know exactly what it is, but I do know that I think that if they took some MDMA, they would use words. They would think about it more deeply. And I wonder if it is fear. A lot of people describe it as fear of women or fear of other people getting power. And so, yeah, that is something I keep coming back to, is like, maybe I just got to talk to some dudes on MDMA.
That would be sweet. Would love to observe. I think I personally think that fear and control are like pretty linked. And my understanding of it is like some people, and a lot of them are men, don't want to be like in a situation where they don't have control. And that's what it feels like to them, is that they are like losing control of how they understand things and what they can do and like why they can do it. Like they've never needed to really explain those things because they've always been in a position of power where they don't have to. And now when people go up to them and be like, well, why did you do that? They like don't really have a good reason. And like for the most part. And then like when they do have a reason, it forces them to like confront that reason, right? Like it's like, oh, why did you catcall that lady? And they're like, oh, because like I wanted to like compliment her. And they're like, is that really a reason? I was like, no, it's because like I feel bad about myself, or like she would never look at me if I didn't. And it's like, well, okay, let's like talk about that.
Yeah, and I think the reason why I don't know, a lot of people talk about, I don't know how to say this, but a lot of they talk about men having no emotional intelligence, right? Like the reason why we're so confounded by people confronting us about catcalling or things like that is because we don't have an answer, or maybe we don't have a connection to the emotions, or I don't know. I don't know where to go from here. I like a couple different. Going back to my conversations I've had with you in my mind the last 2 weeks, this could branch into two different ways. One is I think about when I was in film school and I looked around and literally everyone in my class looked exactly like me. Like not only a white man, but also a white man with brown hair about my height, wearing similar clothes to me and everything. And so I remember seeing that and being like, wow, so we're the ones all out there telling the stories. And we're also the ones who star in all those stories. So, and then the whole world consumes those stories. And so we've always been the main character in everything, not only in movies and TV and everything, but in life. And because of that, I guess the unconscious expectation when you look at men is like they could be anything, they could do anything, because we've seen them in so many different contexts. You don't know what to expect. You just have to react to them. Does that sound correct, or is that insane what I just said?
No. That like makes a lot of sense. It's like, what is that like phrase that like everybody thinks that they're like the protagonist of their own story, or like they're the hero of
exactly
story. And I think like that impacts like a lot of how I feel about like when I act or when I don't act, right? It's like, well, you know, you can't just have a straightforward story because that just doesn't make a good story. And like I can't nobody likes a boring hero, and so I must do like X, Y, and Z things because that makes me seem more interesting, and maybe people will believe that like I'm the true protagonist. And I don't know if men go through that like loop-de-loop of thinking of like why am I doing this? Am I doing this because it makes it a better narrative, or am I doing this because I genuinely want to do it? But I would say that like the option that I sometimes have to like deal with myself is that like it can be really, really nice, and it feels great, I think, to like facilitate and empower other people around you. And like I think it's just as productive and just as like quote unquote heroic to do that.
Yeah, I would say so.
So
too.
You can like keep buying into that like hero protagonist narrative if you want, and I think like that it clearly works for some people, but like what, maybe interrogate like what it means to be a hero.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, for sure. Yeah. Our definition of hero right now, or like, yeah, in popular culture, is pretty much like a masculine dude who doesn't give a fuck about anyone, who does what he wants and considers no other perspectives. So I would agree that what the definition of hero or what a hero looks like is something that could be updated.
Yeah, and I think it's like interesting when you think about like the whole like anti-hero renaissance that happened. I mean, I guess it's like still happening like in television, right? Like, why do we care about fucking Jack Bauer? Well, because he makes it seem like a more interesting hero. And, like, does interesting mean being a weird, violent sociopath? Like, I guess in this context, but like that's not representative of, I think, how we would genuinely want our heroes to be.
Going back to, I'm the main character of everything, right? I guess it's, the way I think of it is, I am the default. I am man. I am human with no other asterisks. Whenever because white men have described or have been telling all the stories, we are, everyone else, if you're a different race, a different gender or something, you are human plus a woman, you're human plus black, you're human. And because of that, because of I'm the default, I'm almost invisible. All of the rules of society fall around me and are in relation to me. And so my identity is not a white man. My identity is just nothing almost. And so that's why a lot of these things, a lot of the things that people are pointing out, I think are taking guys by surprise because those things are invisible. I don't know if I've said that better in my mind before.
I mean, I guess like my question is like, if there's this feeling of like you, the default, being invisible, do you feel compelled to do things that like highlight or differentiate yourself so that you can get, whatever modifiers that everybody else gets?
I think so.
Because I think that's such an interesting way to look at it, and I've like never really heard anybody articulate it in that way.
Well, here's one way I've been thinking of it, and I really love. Shout out to Wendy Chan. She's my favorite media theorist. But in her first book, Control and Freedom in the Age of Fiber Optics, she talks about how porn, if you go online and you look at porn and you look at the categories, you see that they all are oriented around the assumption that you are a white male. They're like, MILF, lesbian, BDSM. The assumption is that you are a white male looking for porn. And someone who is not a white male looking at porn might go to that site and realize and see like, oh, this is not really for me exactly. It's almost like you're wearing someone else's prescription of glasses. But if it's your own prescription, because I didn't realize that until she pointed it out, that sexuality in general, or something when you say something is sexy, it's not including, transsexual sexuality, lesbian sexuality. It's talking about straight sexuality. Right. Straight male sexuality is the default. And so everyone is forced to almost wear my glasses and almost start to question themselves as to like, is this my prescription? Well, it's the way everything is, so there must be something true about it.
Right.
But I still feel like people that aren't white male must feel some psychological tension. Like, is this the case? But I'm saying as a white male, I don't see that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I view it as like 0 to 10 scale of like certainty. Right. So I am envious of you because there's like there's a certainty to like your perspective. Like, not only because the world reflects that identity back at you, however you want to like put it out, but also because there's no like question that your glasses work, right? Like, you looked through it, it's clear as day. But for everybody else, it's distorted, and it's like wondering if like, oh, it's like my eyes that are messed up. It's not the prescription that's messed up. And that's like that certainty component. And I think and like speaking for like just myself as like somebody who like strongly identifies as like a Hong Kong person, who strongly identifies as somebody from the American South, like it is about navigating like how certain do I feel about like bits of my identity, right? I feel really, really certain about my identity as like somebody from the American South. And that's like because I spent the most time there. I've had the most amount of feedback like as that part of my identity. But like in the context, for example, of like the film festival, I constantly wonder, I'm constantly uncertain of like, am I Asian enough? Am I Chinese enough? Am I like Hong Kong enough to make these decisions or to like lead these conversations? But like I don't think that ever gets solved. I think like even in a perfect utopia, people will constantly be uncertain of their identity. The question is whether or not white men will also be okay with feeling that uncertainty.
Yeah, I would say that the uncertainty you're talking about is exactly what we are all feeling now. I would say that exactly. I can say not totally. I think I've always been angsty and like, who am I?
Yeah.
But I feel I can remember making art when I was younger and thinking that my only job was to be my true self as loudly as possible. Like, it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. These are my decisions. This is right because I am me. And yeah, but I think right now, I think I don't know what, it's a lot of things that have been going on that have made me think. You said you're envious of me because you think I'm so certain, but I would say that going back to the glasses metaphor,
Mm-hmm.
you know how like 3D glasses work, the red and blue, where like the red lens cancels out all of the lines that are red,
Mm-hmm.
and the blue cancels out the blue. I feel like maybe a better metaphor is like men have been like there's been a order or a script that about how things work, and it's written in red ink all over the universe, and men are all wearing these red glasses.
Right.
And so they just, everyone else can see all the red lines. Well, we can't, but we benefit from seeing them.
Right.
But and they say that in general, people don't recognize the headwinds. They only recognize the problems. And so the fact that the whole world is oriented to help us and benefit us is not really even seen at all, because those aren't problems. Those are never, those you wouldn't recognize things that are going your way. You only recognize, oh, my parents won't give me a car. Where am I going to get? How am I going to drive? So you know what I mean? Like, problems are the only things you see. So, but yeah, but now I feel like I'm starting to see all the red lines,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm seeing that, going back to like the language thing, I have like a subconscious narrative about the way the world works that is second nature to me, that runs in the background, that I now realize is like a betrayal, is like a lie that hurts people. And so the things now, when I think about like the urges, those same urges that I used to feel whenever I would make art and stuff, like, this is how I feel and I'm going to do it. I'm like, okay, well, is that feeling, how is that feeling hurt people? Or are you sure that that feeling is, I don't know, what gives you the right to feel that way,
Right.
etc. So now that same confidence that I used to have, I question it 100%. I almost don't. I'm paralyzed by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have always had that issue. I think there was like a brief, tiny point in my life, like sophomore year of college when things were like still like going okay, that I had that confidence where I'm like, oh yeah, like I got some sweet ideas and sweet perspectives to show people. But I think I hit that wall that you're hitting like back again, like that had started like years ago again because it got harder and harder to navigate whether or not I wanted to add to all the noise that I was already perceiving. So like I still think I'm stuck in there, but the way that I tried to articulate it to a friend, we were talking about Roma, right? We were talking about Alfonso Cuarón's Roma. I haven't watched it yet, but you know,
I haven't seen it.
Read some think pieces on it, right? Like read some quick reviews on it, and the idea of like domestic workers and like the culture of domestic workers and like where's Cuarón really coming from and all that kind of stuff. And like the way that I thought about it was that like I don't think he shouldn't have done it, right? Like I don't think he shouldn't have revealed a perspective of like that many people have never seen like or heard of or thought about. But I also think it's like you take it with a grain of salt because it's still like manipulated through his lens. But like that's unique and that's different. And it also doesn't negate a creator that is, you know, who's like formerly a domestic worker or has like a much closer relationship to that perspective from also telling that story. Right? Because I don't know. I think I've been trying to rationalize it as like there are no real original stories anyway. So let's just do it. And let's just be like critical about it and like revel in being able to analyze things, even if like the ultimate analysis is like, wow, that was dumb.
Yeah. So yeah, that's you're kind of saying what I've been fearing, which is like, how do I make art that's not problematic? Like,
sure.
I might be trying to make something that says all these really, really nice things, but ultimately I might do something that I don't realize is actually a little bit counterproductive. And I'm like, all right, well, I don't want to make that. I want to make the art that can get us to the world that we all want. I don't want the small increments, because that's what we keep having is like we like one step forward, one step back, where the art is helping people in some way, and then in other ways you could see it reinvigorates all the old narrative.
I mean, I definitely understand that fear, but I think I've been trying to tell myself that like you have to do it, and then you have to get the criticisms, and then you have to like adapt to that. And yeah, it's gonna take a bunch of time, but I don't know how else you would do it. Like I don't know how else you could like skip the steps. Because I feel like people keep trying to skip the steps, right? Like people keep trying to like jump from like whatever to like wokeness. And then like we obviously perceive that as like inauthentic. But I also don't know like how else you would do that. Like I would love to give you an alternate solution. But like I just don't think there is. If there is, like I'm just like maybe I haven't found the right guru that is gonna tell me. Like maybe that's like the next thing is like I have to go like talk to a shit ton of people and be like, how did you skip all the steps? But I mean it's I don't know, like it all like we wouldn't be having this conversation if like we didn't have this like underlying fear of like human mortality, right? And so like let's just like keep letting that angst motivate us. Like that's the only way that I can view it without just like going back to bed and like trying not to wake up again.
Like I all like when I was in high school and college and stuff, I read this thing I wrote in college about how I don't care what I do in the world. I just want to make a big change. I want to help people. I saw the Matrix and I was like, yeah, that's right. Everyone's in the fucking Matrix and I'm Neo and I got to free them and I got to do it with art. And I know I can do it. And I still feel like I do want to help people with art. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, no, I do. And I think like ultimately like my career is like a really poor attempt at doing all of that. Is like I had a really hard time for a while trying to juggle like the fact that like I have to do some capitalistic things to do the good art that helps people. And I think I'm like slightly better at it, but then I do kind of these like, right, like I sink into this film festival and into this nonprofit like for free, like many hours of my life that like arguably could be used more purposefully. But I don't think if I didn't sink all this time and effort that I would be okay with like, you know, like I just had like a like an interview and it's going to be for like a tech ad and I'm like, yeah, like that's dumb and it's going to be really stressful, but like I also like have to do it. Like I have to try to get that job or like I'm not going to be able to sink the time in and like be able to reach out to like my filmmaker friends that I know are doing really great work and like trying to help them. And I think that's like the catch 22 of entertainment. And the reason why like being in New York media for like a year plus now, almost 2 years now, like having never been in like journalism or media was like that was like the hard part. The hard part was thinking that New York media was going to give me that fulfillment of like helping people and like making art that was like different from entertainment, which was this like slimy place where like only a few people were making good, helpful art. I think like what I've learned is that like New York media is exactly the same thing as entertainment. It's just keep putting this like mask on of like, oh, I'm a good person and I'm revealing so much stuff. I'm like, no, you're not. You're the same assholes on a different coast, but you also just have to be lying to people about like your goodwill.
Yeah.
Which sucks a lot. And I think that's why like I get really excited when I see like people trying to buck that trend. But there's also that like cynical seed in my body now where it's like, well, now that I've been like inside of publishing, like I know it's gonna be real hard and like the likelihood of success is real low.
Yeah. I had that same trajectory, I think, because like before I came to New York, I don't live there anymore, but I live in Los Angeles now, but I was making music videos and my whole thing was like, yeah, I'm just going to make music videos and like probably films and that's art. Art's better. Art's the good thing. And then I started working at like Vox Media and stuff and doing things for The Verge. And I was like, you know what? This is art and I can change the world. And this is different because this is the truth. And then I remember thinking the same thing, like this is because the thing I actually have in our previous virtual mental conversations I've had with you, I brought up this video I did for Taser for The Verge, where it was coming out with those Axon Flexes, those police on-body cameras. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It was when those were brand new, and The Verge went to their factory and looked at like how they made them, and they showed a bunch of like actual video and talked to some police officers. And in general, it was pretty positive. It was like, cool, more accountability. If all the police are recording everything they do, then we'll be able to see everything and they'll have to be less racist. And I had to edit this video and I remember thinking, this is good. I mean, Taser, you know, whatever, it's Taser, this is cool. in general, I was pro. I was like, more surveillance or more cameras equals more accountability equals everything's better. And as the years have gone by, I realized like, oh no, actually things aren't better. They actually use these against the people a lot of the times. A lot of times they lose the footage. And then in addition to that, like Wendy Chun talks about in her book about how, who is it? The Rodney King thing from 1991, where this guy was beat by a bunch of policemen on video, and he never had a weapon or anything, but he was still charged as guilty, or the policemen were never charged because in the minds of the jury, like, black people are already violent before the camera started, or whatever. I got a deep understanding of why on-body police cameras aren't actually a solution.
Right.
But I was just a fucking 26-year-old idiot just editing it, and it didn't matter. I had no credentials. I had no reason to be doing it, but it was entertaining. It looked slick, and I was like, fuck, dude. I don't know anything. And I confidently said all those facts, or I confidently edited together all those things. So, yeah, and then... I started to think like, okay, this is my responsibility. This is my responsibility to tell the truth or like say something helpful. But all I can really do is be entertaining, I guess. I don't know what the whole point of that is, but basically that my horror with like saying something that seems progressive and then actually being kind of problematic.
Sure. I mean, I think it brings up the question of like intentionality, right? Like your intentions in no way were to promote something that like ultimately fails, right? Or like is ultimately a part of a solution, but not like a wholesale solution. And I think like, like Green Book, I haven't watched it. It's like not the type of movie for me, but I love Viggo Mortensen, so like I kept up with it. And like the question is like, oh, did these like white filmmakers intentionally try to like obscure Dr. Don Shirley's story and to paint like his relationship with his black family in a certain way and to make it this white savior story? I don't know. And I don't know if like it matters to people. But like they also haven't proven their intentions otherwise, right? Like I hear you and I could have watched that video and been like, oh man, he didn't know anything. Like that's crazy. But like to hear your intentions, I'm like, okay, I can understand why the video is the way that it is. And I think that's what makes art is that there's no like objective way to make it. Like we're just trying our best.
Yeah, I guess that was my problem with. I had sort of like a psychic freak out with the media in general, which it's still happening. Which is like I understood that the like premise of journalism is that it is objective or as objective as possible. Yeah. But I knew everyone around me was like a kind of well-off white kid for the most part. How can we possibly have all the perspectives? How can I possibly research enough to say anything that won't be like mired in bias? And so, yeah, I had that. Do you think that we should drop the idea of objectivity in journalism, or how do you think we should move forward with journalism?
I mean, I do think that most of the journalists that I admire, and like, like even within our like Slack, like I admire a lot of the work that everybody in our Slack has done, right? Like I think AJ is like an amazing reporter, but I also think like if you were to ask her, she would be like, yeah, like we paint a certain picture based on who we are, even when even if the paint is all the same, right? The facts are the same. Like how we build it is going to affect how people perceive it. And so like objective journalism is like never, I don't think it has ever been a thing. and like will never be a thing. And I think like the people that want journalism to be the helpful tool that it can be, like, understand that. And it's the dumb people that think that, like, oh, you know, if I axios my way through it, like, that's real journalism. And I'm like, no, like, you made choices on what facts you're going to use and what language you're going to use. Like, those all change how people, like, digested those facts.
Yeah. On the one hand, I'm like, it should, like, I respect the scientific method in that it's trying to be objective and go through all these steps. And I feel like journalism is similar in that they feel like if they follow these rules, it will sort of launder any bias. Like, it will strip everything down to its essential facts. And I respect it. I think, but do you think that there's any way, like, I keep coming back to this idea, like, how could I wear my bias on my sleeve? Or, like, is that what's called for? Like, every journalist that writes something, somehow you know where they're coming from, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, I mean, it's like providing context, but like, for example, like the scientific method is built so that you do lay out your biases and lay out your doubts, right? Like, part of that is what science is. Science isn't this thing where, and I think most contemporary scientists understand that when they build experiments and when they publish results, they are doing it from a specific perspective. And the best scientists understand that, and they make sure that they provide that context for their peers and for science communicators to translate for normal people. Like, that's a fundamental part of science. And I think that's something that people misunderstand. Science is not about rigid rules. Science is about discussion and debate about the rules. Science requires people to agree, not to know for certain that, like, this is a fact, right? Like, that's just what science is. And I think that works for journalism too, is that there should be a tipping point where, like, there are certain facts that are agreed upon. But we also know the process that, like, happened to get to that point. Is, like, the average consumer gonna know that entire process? No. I mean, that's, like, the point of people writing in a certain way, is to help people understand that without having to go through the whole process. But, like, the people who are curious, the people who are editing or are curating should have access to, like, what that process was. Like, I don't know, like the drama earlier this week about Ariel and the Margaret Sullivan book, and how Ariel was, like, painted as a person.
yeah.
That,
for those listeners, Ariel Dunham-Ross, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. It's a French. Dunham-Ross. She's a Vice reporter, and she was profiled in this book. What was the book?
It's like Margaret Sullivan's book, new book that's coming out. I don't remember. It's like Truth Merchants or Truth.
Oh yeah, Merchants of Truth. Correct. Yeah. And this whole thing is pretty much like, this is how the news gets made. Here's how the sausage is made, folks.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so, like, there's this huge outcry because, you know, in this paragraph, Margaret Sullivan poorly summarizes, and, like, to a misleading point, like, Ariel's, like, whole career, and, like, whether or not you should respect Ariel and, like, her work. And it's like, well, no. Like, if you were to just read that paragraph, no. But if you actually interrogate the facts, then, like, yes. And it's, like, on Margaret as a journalist and as like a writer to like provide that context, right? Not even the facts or the details that she put into that paragraph that were true, she contextualized in a way that was false. And I think that's the danger zone. And that's where most people stumble. Most people do like find the right facts, but they contextualize it in a way that is poor or like that miscommunicates what the fact is.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel like again, is this going back to media literacy? Are you just like advocating for education and people understanding what journalism is? Or do you feel like there's anything that like in journalism you would change overall?
I think a little bit of both. I do think that better media literacy would be helpful because it would force journalists to be accountable, right? Like if people are more literate about that stuff, then they can confront journalists that do things poorly. On the journalism end, I guess it's about being honest. Like whenever a journalist sits down or whenever like we sit down to like do something is just to like be honest about like what that gut feeling you had about the story is. And then like taking a little bit of time to think about it. And then every now and then, like while you're building that story, to do the same thing. And
yeah.
I also think it's like working with like good editors and like, because I think that like to me, like the like hierarchy of having like writers and editors and like you might have a managing editor or you might have an editor in chief or whatever. Like I think that hierarchy makes sense if all the editors are doing their work and like holding people accountable. But I am not sure if like that type of power is like actually being implemented that way in most places. Like I have, like having never been an editor, like I have no idea if they're even allowed or empowered to do that type of stuff. But to me, like that's the real benefit of editors.
Yeah, that it's almost like you're saying that the original writer's job is to just sort of like lash out and say whatever they're feeling, and then the next person's supposed to look at it and be like, yo, here's what's wrong with everything you're saying, or why, here's the biases you may not see, and here's what things to weave in to like account for that.
Yeah, I guess it is like forcing people to confront the piece. And the hope is like you work with enough great editors that like provide that input productively, that like you start doing that yourself. And so like when it gets the next time you make something and you give it back to the editor, like the editor doesn't give you the same comments. They like find something more and they find like, you know, we should like keep iterating in a positive fashion. But yeah, I'm not really sure if editors are given that power anymore or even given the space and time to do it well. I think like the whole like the VCs have really like ruined any like space for people to do that. But like I would love a world where that actually is true.
What do you mean by that? The VCs?
Like I think
the venture capitalists?
Yeah, the people who like created media companies or bought media companies thinking that like they can make a lot of money off of it, or like that's the best way to like capitalize on influence. And then right, like the purpose of the publication or the purpose of the company is not to tell people the news. The purpose is to like make as much money as possible. And like having self-reflective, self-aware writers and editors probably isn't the most like capitalistic choice.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love it for it to be that. But that's also like assuming like a meritocracy works, and I really don't think it does.
Mm-hmm. So, what do you think the ultimate fix is?
I think when John and I were talking about it, they were talking about like subway etiquette. And I was like, isn't the ultimate fix just everybody being like more compassionate and empathetic? And he was like, yeah. And I feel like it's the same way. Is like, if we were more empathetic and compassionate, then like we would hopefully solve some of the problems by working together. But I'm not really sure how like actionable that type of solution is.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same sort of like vague, like I always say that people need to be more vulnerable in general, which is another like vague thing, like empathy. I feel like empathy is overstated its welcome.
Sure.
Because freaking Gary Vaynerchuk has a wine called Empathy, so you know it's been taken over.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes people misunderstand empathy, right? I think they go like, oh, of course I empathize with this person. And I was like, but do you really? Like, do you feel what they're feeling? Because if they really did, then I think people wouldn't make some of the actions that they do make.
Yeah. Right? I don't know. Like, there's that thing about like VR being the empathy machine. Like, if you were in the point of view of like a refugee or whatever, then suddenly you get what they're feeling. And in some ways, I'm like, yeah, I do, because I've used lots of VR. I know that like embodiment and like feeling like you're actually there makes the memory stick in you in a different way. But there's always like, you weren't there before. You didn't see this kid, like say you're like a like, I don't know, 10-year-old kid refugee. You didn't see this kid's life as 10 years before that. You don't know all the little things. You're only bringing your life experience to now this experience. And so as much as you may feel like you were in their shoes, you were in their shoes, but still in your mind. And so I feel like empathy can only take us so far.
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, like the next step after you find, empathize with that feeling is like connecting it and relating it to a personal experience. I think like that is when like a true connection is made. So if it's like, oh, seeing that 10-year-old refugee, you can empathize his fear and his uncertainty, well, then like relate it back to like if you had a moment, when you were a kid and you were like lost in the mall and you were so scared that you were never going to see your parents again, like connecting those two like scenarios so that you can really bring a little bit of your context to their feeling. I think that probably is way more motivating than just being like, oh, I feel that way too. It's like you have to like really apply it to your life. But that's like a lot of extra work.
Yeah, I've also heard that like that sort of thinking is like, well, your feeling isn't their feeling. Their feeling is particular to them. And so you bringing your memory to their experience is just like, replacing their experience. And yeah, so that's why I've been like, for a while, I remember this guy, I don't remember who he was, this journalist, wrote a book or an article for The Atlantic or something called like Against Empathy, and basically like why VR is not good and stuff. And I tweeted at him, I was like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about. VR is going to save the world. And since then, I'm like, oh no, I was wrong. Although I still like VR has potential for a lot of cool stuff.
No, I agree. But I think there's like, I really do want VR to work a little bit more. And I still haven't had like a VR experience that like blew me away. I've had like good ones and I had fun ones and things like that. But like my favorite thing is like the UN has like a report because they did like this brief pilot program where they like did these refugee programs through a VR, or refugee stories through a VR, and they compared it to like when they just do their normal pitch where they like tell the exact same story, right, to try to get people to donate. And like the percentage of not only the people that donated increased for the people who like had the VR experience, but also like the amount of money increased significantly. And so like there is something to it. Like there is this like clear connection. I think it's right now it's still tied to like it's just so inaccessible. And it is just so hard to really do it well. But like I think that's also like the exciting part of it, is that like even in its like kind of shitty version now, like UNICEF has had such success. Like imagine, 10 years from now when we maybe figure it out, the like potential of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I go back and forth. I'm like, I on the one hand hate myself for like believing in it so hard, but then I'm like, it is pretty crazy.
I mean, like, if we can't like believe in silly things, then like, what's the point of belief?
Yeah. One thing I was gonna ask, maybe this will lead to the end of this. Why did you think this was gonna be risky doing this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, so I think it comes back to that like paralysis.
Oh, I'll tell the audience. Sorry, this is I'll tell the audience. I asked you to record this podcast, and you were like, I've been thinking about taking more risks lately. And I was like, I don't know. There's only about 100 people that listen to this thing. I don't think it's so risky, but why? Yeah, why is this a risk?
It's that paralysis thing where it's like I get really caught up in like making anything, and then like let alone like releasing it and like having other people see it and like judge it and like assume things about me. And like that's why like for a while, so like one of the freelance things I've been working on is that like I work on a lot of other people's podcasts. Like I produce other people's stuff, and like very rarely am I on it because like that's not the point of the show. But like every time I bring that up, people are like, "Oh, you work on podcasts? Like, what's your podcast?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't do that. I don't have that," because that's like really scary to me, right? Because I think there is like an intimacy to podcasts, or at least an intimacy that I like about certain podcasts, that like I felt really uncomfortable doing. And so like being on this podcast is like not only am I like making a choice to make something, right? But I'm also like being more personal about it. And even if it is only like 100 people, that's still like more than 0 people, and it's still more than like the judgy voice in my brain that like stops me from making anything. So yeah, like I guess like that's the risk that I'm talking about. It's the same thing. Like I don't generally like to go on dates because I think it's like really risky to have people and to be vulnerable in front of a person. It's like, well, I'm gonna take more risks and like try to be more vulnerable in front of people. But yeah, it's probably like a bad word. It's like a poor choice of word to like explain.
I don't think it is.
But like that's how I viewed it like in that moment.
No, I don't think it's the wrong words. I just wanted to see how you thought about it. Because no, I agree. And going way back to the beginning where you were talking about people, you envy people who, what was the word used?
Oh, shameless.
Like shameless, exactly. I feel like what I've been seeing lately is that thing that you call shameless, I would call like, you call it vulnerable, being vulnerable, or just saying what they think. And it's like the Kanye attitude, it's the Trump attitude. And I feel like, I feel like there is something to that too, like speaking without any editing. And that's kind of why I'm doing these podcasts lately without any editing, is like, I want all my mistakes to be out there. And I want I want to tap into the power of that idea of I didn't rehearse this. This is what I'm saying now, and I'm sticking behind it. I think that the way I would critique that attitude in general is that I feel like maybe what we need to do now is even speaking vulnerably, being shameless, but maybe I think a lot of those people, they say their thing and then they say it confidently, and any critique is haters going against, like, that's me, that's the authentic me. If you don't like it, then fuck you.
Yeah.
And it takes that confidence to even say that stuff in the first place. And so, yeah, you have to respect it. But I guess, and it's going to be hard, I feel like I want to say whatever, I want to say whatever's on my mind and just say it. Ugh. But I guess I'm trying to almost the art or the thing I say, its only function is to receive feedback on it and to be like, I look, this is what my brain said, or this is what my like bad habits said. And I guess the end of the piece of the art is the feedback almost. And like, I don't know. I guess my whole thing is like, I'm trying to, I know you're not supposed to listen to the haters, but I want my instincts to be checked almost, like maybe that, I feel like that's maybe the way forward is like, I like that Twitter gives us the ability to like speak before or act before thinking. But I guess what we're missing at this point is like the idea that, I don't know, to like hear the feedback, or that your instincts might be wrong. Yeah. I don't know though. Maybe that's dangerous. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I like your idea that like true holistic art is like not just like the creation and like the release of the art, but also the feedback that comes back. Like the art isn't truly complete until you get the like any response from anybody. I think that's like a really interesting way to look at it. I think it kind of goes for me. I think it goes back to that intentionality. Is like like in this podcast, in this space, like you're making the choice, and you're like saying like, this is me unfiltered. This is me trying to understand what I'm going through, and this is me like welcoming feedback and criticism, which I think is great. But I think there's also the other side, is that when we're just thinking, or we're like in pre-production or developing a story, like that is also just as good and as vulnerable as like us also just talking. I think it's like being okay with that dichotomy and not getting too caught up in like one or the other, right? Like I think like Trisha Paytas doing her videos the way that she does her videos all the time, I think it's like not truly representative like of her ability. But like she doesn't allow herself to, or she like very rarely allows herself to do like deliberate intentional pieces, right? Like she does her weird little music videos, and she does like larger collabs, and I think that gives us like a hint of like what her like deliberate intentional art could look like. But I think she's like too caught up in the like unfiltered stuff.
In the idea that uncut means authentic, means better, or something.
Yeah, and then I think we're in the opposite boat, where we get caught up in thinking that, the only true version of our art is like our deliberate, intentional, highly prepared stuff, and not, the more unfiltered stuff. And so like we have to balance it as much as she has to balance it.
Yeah. And I think in general, the world though, right now is perceiving her kind of art, if you call it that, her vlogs art, as more authentic and better. And I guess I'm like, I feel like for the most part, that's like hurting us. Like all the mavericks in the world saying whatever they want, whenever they want. I feel like it's hurting us right now, but I'm trying to like flip it into like, how do we take advantage of that?
Yeah.
But yeah, I know what you mean though. Like I'm going back and forth between like the most authentic thing is to like act as fast as you can or react as fast as you can, and that's the truest thing. But it's true, like art that takes time, poetry, films, photography, art is can be just as authentic as something that you just said right off the dome. But we're in this time, this moment where that kind of art is not as respected or something, or it's not seen as authentic.